If war ever breaks out between the United States and China, one of the first ideas that will tempt strategists is brutally simple. Cut China off at the Strait of Malacca in a war. On a map, the argument looks powerful. The Strait of Malacca is one of the world's most important maritime choke points. About 23.2 million barrels per day of petroleum and other liquids moved through Malacca in the first half of 2025, equal to roughly 29% of global maritime oil flows. That is an enormous concentration of energy traffic moving through one narrow corridor. For China, the vulnerability is even sharper. About 80% of China's crude oil imports from countries other than Russia travel by sea through the Malacca Strait. That is why the phrase Malacca dilemma has endured for years in discussions of Chinese grand strategy. The concern is obvious. If a rival can place sustained pressure on this route, then China's energy security, industrial output, and wartime endurance all come under strain. So the question sounds almost irresistible. Could the United States strangle China through Malacca in a war? The serious answer is this. The United States could probably disrupt China's use of Malacca severely, but strangling China through the strait would be much harder, slower, messier, and more politically explosive than many people assume.
That distinction matters because too many discussions of blockade collapse into a lazy binary. Either America can close Malacca or it cannot. Either China is trapped or it is not. Real strategy does not work that way. There are really three levels of pressure here. The first is harassment, making passage riskier, more expensive, and less predictable. The second is disruption, materially reducing the amount of Chinese-bound shipping that can move reliably through the route. The third is strangulation, sustaining enough disruption for long enough that China's broader war economy begins to break down under cumulative pressure. Those are not the same thing, and the gap between disruption and strangulation is where the real analysis begins. If we start with the strongest version of the American case, the U.S. clearly has meaningful leverage. The U.S. Navy retains major Indo-Pacific reach, long experience in maritime surveillance and interdiction, and an important logistical foothold in Singapore. That matters because Singapore sits at the southern entrance to the Malacca-Singapore Strait system, where dense flows compress into a narrow and highly monitored maritime corridor. In a real war, Washington probably would not begin by declaring an old-fashioned blockade, in the theatrical sense, as if a few destroyers could just park across the water and close one of the busiest trade arteries on Earth. The more realistic approach would be selective maritime interdiction, backed by surveillance, legal designations, financial pressure, and insurance shock. The United States would not need to stop every ship. It would need to identify critical Chinese-bound cargoes, pressure shippers and insurers, raise war risk costs, and make the route unreliable enough that shipping behavior changes. In the modern world, maritime coercion is not just a naval act. It is a system of pressure built from force, information, markets, and fear. And in the opening stages of a war, this could work. China's dependence is real, and the alternatives are limited. Yes, Chinese-bound traffic could be rerouted through other Indonesian passages, especially the Sunda and Lombok Straits. But rerouting is not a free escape hatch. Diverting through the Sunda Strait could add about 967 nautical miles and roughly 2.5 days, while using the Lombok Strait could add around 1,600 nautical miles and about 4.8 days. In wartime, those extra days are not just an inconvenience. They mean more fuel burned, more hulls tied up in transit, fewer voyages completed, tighter tanker availability, and greater exposure across a wider maritime battle space. So yes, at the level of disruption, the American case is strong. The United States could probably make China's use of Malacca far less reliable and far more expensive in a serious conflict. But disruption is not strangulation. To understand why, the first thing to grasp is that time matters more than many people realize. Even if Chinese maritime inflows were hit hard, Beijing would not instantly become helpless. China imported around 11.77 million barrels per day of crude in early 2026, produced about 4.49 million barrels per day domestically, and is estimated to hold over 1.2 billion barrels in reserves. That does not mean China is comfortable.
it does mean China is not a glass empire that shatters the moment one sea lane comes under pressure. Malacca pressure would operate less as an instant chokehold and more as a campaign of cumulative stress. The strategic question would not be whether China feels pain. It would. The harder question would be whether China feels decisive pain faster than it can adapt, and before broader blowback fractures the coalition applying that pressure at home.
That is where the map starts lying to people. On a map, Malacca looks like an off switch. In reality, it is a pressure point inside a much larger system. The second thing to understand is that Malacca is not merely a military problem. It is also a legal and sovereign space, and that sharply complicates any simple blockade fantasy. This is not a maritime corridor that coastal states can casually close in peacetime, nor one that an outside power can treat as a private valve without running into major legal and diplomatic consequences. That matters because the Strait of Malacca is bordered by Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. These are not decorative countries sitting politely beside someone else's war plan. They are sovereign states with their own interests, their own domestic politics, and their own strong incentives to resist the idea that an outside great power can simply weaponize one of the world's most vital commercial corridors. The map makes Malacca look like a naval choke point. In reality, it is also a sovereignty choke point. And then there is the third problem, which may be the most dangerous of all: blowback. A campaign to squeeze China at Malacca would not remain neatly targeted on China. The reason Malacca is so attractive as a pressure point is the same reason it is so dangerous to weaponize. The route is not just important to Beijing, it is central to broader Asian and global trade flows. That means any sustained military pressure there would ripple outward into freight markets, war risk insurance, tanker availability, refinery planning, and regional import costs. The United States would not be aiming at an isolated Chinese pipeline. It would be putting military pressure on one of the busiest commercial arteries on Earth. And that changes the politics immediately. That is why the real hinge in this whole scenario is not just Washington or Beijing. It is Southeast Asia.
Singapore matters because it is the most operationally important local node. But Singapore also has every reason to avoid being publicly recast as the state that helped transform Asia's main sea lane into a tool of economic strangulation. Malaysia and Indonesia matter even more politically because they are more directly tied to sovereignty and would likely resist any overt attempt by an external navy to treat the strait as a controlled war valve. So the real struggle around Malacca would not simply be about ships and missiles. It would be about access, legitimacy, diplomatic tolerance, and the willingness of local states to absorb escalating commercial and security risk. China, of course, would not sit still while all this unfolds. Beijing would respond along several lines at once. It would reroute what it could. It would maximize overland and pipeline alternatives. It would lean harder on non-Malacca supply sources. It would likely escort at least some priority cargoes, and it would try to widen the costs for the United States and its partners. China also has another advantage that often gets lost in simplistic arguments. It has scale. Its navy is large and growing. That does not eliminate the Malacca problem, but it does mean China is not a helpless power waiting to be cut off. It has the capacity to complicate interdiction, raise costs, retaliate elsewhere, and stretch the campaign into a broader contest of endurance. And endurance is exactly the point. The real strategic question is not whether the United States could hurt China through Malacca. It almost certainly could. The real question is whether it could sustain enough pressure for enough time to force a strategic break before China adapts, and without causing enough collateral damage to split partners and undermine the campaign itself. That is a much harder question. It is also the right one.
Because once you think in those terms, the answer becomes more sober and more realistic. Yes, the United States could probably generate serious stress on Chinese energy logistics centered on Malacca. Yes, it could reduce reliability, raise costs, and turn a major dependency into a wartime liability. But that is still not the same thing as a clean strangulation strategy. To truly strangle China through Malacca, Washington would need more than naval reach. It would need sustained regional tolerance, legal and diplomatic cover, a tolerance for economic spillover, and the ability to maintain pressure as China adapts. In other words, it would need not just maritime power, but political endurance. So the deeper conclusion is this: Malacca is a real Chinese vulnerability, but it is not an American off switch. It is a place where geography gives the United States leverage, but where law, sovereignty, commercial interdependence, Chinese adaptation, and regional politics take much of that leverage back. In war, Washington could squeeze Malacca hard enough to hurt China. What is much less plausible is the idea that it could do so neatly, cheaply, and without triggering a much wider regional and economic crisis. And that is why Malacca matters. Not because it offers a simple answer, but because it reveals the real nature of modern great power conflict. Even at a choke point this narrow, victory would not depend only on ships. It would depend on time, reserves, rerouting, insurers, local governments, political legitimacy, and the ability to impose pressure without losing the broader strategic balance. Malacca is not just a choke point in geography. It is a choke point in politics.